Jimmy here. Today we're going to have a lesson on some navigational aids that we use as pilots, particularly the VOR. Before we get started, I've done a little reading on different ways that people find direction, and I found some animals that actually do this all on their own. Everybody's heard stories of animals who've been lost all the way across the United States, and they found their way back home from California to New York. And sometimes it's a really big story, or people are, oh, I lost my dog, and the dog came back. But one of the most impressive things that I think are homing pigeons. Homing pigeons, there's a couple theories about how in the world they can find their way. One of those is they have a little compass in their head that kind of points them in the direction they need to go. It aligns them with magnetic north. A new one that recently came out was that they home in on the specific sounds of where they're from. Either way, they have their own navigational aids. Navigational aids are very important to us as pilots, and perhaps one of the most simple or most used navigational aid is a VOR. And if we take a look at what a VOR is, just the letters VOR, it really tells us a lot about what it is and what it does. So VOR is a very high omnidirectional range. Now, if we just take a look at this here, it does tell us a lot. First of all, the VOR operates on a very high frequency, generally from 108 to 117.95. And it's omnidirectional. So if we take a look, if you've never seen a VOR before, or a VOR ground station in real life, it's very unique. And you've probably seen one, you didn't know what it was before. A lot of times you see them out in the middle of the desert. I've seen them between here and Idaho, or between Idaho and Reno. They actually have one. And it's just a little building that sits out there all by itself. And you wonder, what in the world is this little tiny building doing out there? Now, this isn't an exact model, obviously. Looks a little bit like this. This is my VOR. Once you've seen one, you'll never forget it. Now, the omnidirectional range, what that tells us is if we were looking at the top and it's just a circle, the omnidirectional range tells us all the way around. So a circle has 360 degrees, and if I were to go like this, all the way around and have 360 lines coming up, that's how many different ways that this is an omnidirect. That's how many different things I could use to find this particular VOR. And then the range tells us that there's a specific range for this, or a specific volume, a service volume, and we'll get to those in just a minute. Now, a VOR only has enough power to operate in the appropriate or operational service volume that it's set for. There are three different types of volumes. There's high, low, and terminal, and we'll go over those in just a minute as well. But in order to use a VOR, we have to have a couple things. We have to have a few things. First, we actually have to have a ground station. You can't have a navigational aid without the actual ground station. Second is we actually have to have items in the aircraft to help us get to the ground station. So part of that system is the antenna. Have to have an antenna to help us pick up the frequencies. We have to have a receiver in the aircraft to help us identify and tune into those frequencies. And we have to have an instrument to help guide us to those frequencies. Probably one of the most common is an HSI, or a heading indicator. And if you don't know what that HSI is, let's see if I can't draw one for you real fast here. An HSI would look a little something like this. it'll have a CDI in the middle there. And it's got a few. And this is an instrument that we would use to help us find and lead us to the VOR. This is one of my favorites because that's what we use in the helicopters. Now, the important thing to know about a VOR, and in order to even actually use the VOR, is you have to actually have it line of sight. So if the VOR is up on a mountain or behind a mountain and you want to try and use it, you actually have to be able to, essentially if you were to be able to see it, that's how it would have to work. It's called line of sight. And actually it's good to know that most of the VORs will have a voice over them. So if for any reason you lose communications or you can't talk to somebody or you need some help, a lot of VORs will actually be able to do that. If by chance a VOR does not have voice, it'll actually be indicated by a W. So, for example, it'll have the name or it'll say VORW, which means it doesn't have voice capabilities at all. Now, there are a few different ways to identify the VOR. A lot of VORs, they'll have a automated system or someone saying Newberg VOR, but the only positive way to identify a VOR is through Morse code. And if you're not familiar with Morse code, it's just a bunch of dots and dashes, and some of you may have served in the military and might know exactly what it is, or even Boy Scout. But for example, dot, dash, dash, dot, dot. That's Morse code. And when you hear it, it'll be beep, 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 beep. It'll sound very similar to that. Now, most VORs, they're actually considered to be very accurate and excellent within plus or minus 1 degree. It really depends on how well the pilot actually uses the VOR and the equipment that they have, though. If you're able to tune and identify and you're able to follow your instrument, you're going to get to where you need to get to. However, there are a few errors. There's some roughness in there. Usually or sometimes roughness will occur in mountainous terrain, and perhaps even some rotor or prop interference as well. So to help combat some of this, with mountainous terrain, what we're actually going to see is we're going to see a little bit of erratic behavior. The CDI needle in the HSI could start to deflect back and forth a little bit, and we would just need to increase our altitude some. With our rotors or our props for airplanes, really all you have to do is just change your RPM and see if that fixes it a little bit too. The other thing is if you're too close to the VOR, at about 1,000 feet or lower above the VOR, as you continue to get closer, you'll hit what's called the cone of confusion above the VOR. So I'm just going to draw a stick here to simulate my VOR. So this is our VOR station here, and as our little aircraft gets closer, and we're only at 1,000 feet or below, there's this little area here called a cone of confusion, or you might also hear it as a cone of ambiguity. And within this cone of confusion, we're going to notice some eradications. The CDI is going to start to go back and forth. The flag might start to move on us a little bit, and it can be misinterpreted if we're not careful. So the only way to properly identify the station passage or going over this is when our little to from flag actually flips to whatever it was. So if we're going to this here, we're going to have the to flag, which would look like this. And the only way to make sure that we have actually passed this is when we get the from flag, which would look like this. And it really is just a little triangle. It's generally white, a white triangle. Excuse me. Now, the service volumes. Now, there are different types of service volumes that a VOR has. And we'll get through this real fast because it's important to know as I said before, that the range portion of this, it tells us how far these particular ones go. So there are three, like I mentioned before. There's a high, there's a low, and there's a terminal. Now, as helicopter pilots, we're probably not very often going to be using the high or high in the high. But basically, here's our little VOR here, and it'll look similar to this. Here, and then a little shell, and a bigger shell, and then a little shelf again. So what's really important to know at this juncture is that this is 1,000 feet, and here, at this point here, it is 40 nautical miles. And to here, it's 14,500. That's our first shelf. And then it goes up and then back down from there. Now, the low is very, very similar to this. Actually, I need to erase here. Except it only has one shelf. So here's our low. Here's our little VOR. Now, our VOR, this is 1,000 feet. Except the low VOR actually goes all the way up to 18,000 feet. But it is still 40 nautical miles. Now, the terminal one, which is the smaller one, here, it's 1,000 feet to 12,000 feet, and it's only 25 nautical miles wide. So each VOR station has just enough power to fulfill the service areas that they have. And that's important to remember too, because you don't want to use VORs that aren't in the volumes that you need to get from point A to point B. Anyways, if you guys have any questions about anything or comments or concerns, please just leave a message for me, and have a great day.